3 dead, at least 3 more seriously ill, and a cruise ship carrying 149 people from 23 countries floating off the West African coast because no port will let them dock. The suspected killer is hantavirus, a rodent-borne respiratory disease with a mortality rate that can hit 40% in its worst form, and a disease for which there is no widely available vaccine or cure. The WHO says the public risk is low. Cape Verde says not on our shores, and the rest of the world is apparently content to wait and see. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is the WHO's low-risk assessment something we should actually trust, given everything we know about their track record?
Thanks, Emma. Look, the short answer is no, and anyone who's been paying attention for the last 6 years knows exactly why. The WHO spent the critical early weeks of COVID-19 parroting Chinese Communist Party reassurances while a novel coronavirus was already burning through international travel hubs. They were late, they were deferential, and people died because of it. Now we have 3 confirmed deaths on an international vessel, passengers from 23 nations. A ship refused port entry by at least one government, and the WHO is telling us the public risk is low. Maybe it is. I genuinely hope it is. But the WHO has burned their credibility, and we should not be making policy decisions, or travel decisions, or containment decisions based on their institutional word alone. What gives me some confidence here, ironically, is Cape Verde. A small island nation looked at this situation and said, "Not today, we're protecting our people." That's sovereign decision-making in action. That's the kind of clear, decisive call that supranational health bureaucracies are constitutionally incapable of making quickly. The uncomfortable truth is that national governments protecting their own borders and populations will always outperform international bodies on speed and decisiveness, and this story is proving it in real time.
But Marcus, isn't that a little convenient? Cape Verde blocking the ship means a vessel full of sick people has nowhere to go, no medical infrastructure to dock at, no proper treatment facility. Doesn't sovereign self-protection in this case just mean abandoning 149 people to their fate at sea? And Sophia, what's your take on this? Is this a governance failure, a market failure, or both?
Well, look, I think Marcus is right about the WHO, but he's missing the bigger systemic picture here. Yes, Cape Verde made a sovereign call to protect its population, and I respect that. But let's ask the question nobody in the mainstream coverage is asking. How does a rodent-borne pathogen end up on an expedition cruise ship in the first place? This is an industry question as much as a public health question. Expedition cruising is a growing, premium-priced segment of the travel market. These operators charge significant sums precisely on the promise of safe, managed adventure travel. If the biosecurity standards on these vessels are so inadequate that passengers are being exposed to hantavirus, that's a market integrity failure of the first order. The data matters here. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome carries a roughly 38% fatality rate in confirmed U.S. cases, according to CDC figures. 3 dead from an initial cluster on one vessel is not a statistic to be casually reassured about. And I'd argue that the travel insurance industry, the maritime regulatory bodies, and the cruise operators themselves have serious liability questions to answer that are entirely separate from the WHO's risk framing.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that somewhat misses the point entirely. Yes, biosecurity standards on expedition vessels matter. Yes, the maritime industry has questions to answer. But we're sitting here talking about corporate liability while 3 people are dead and a ship is floating in the Atlantic with no port willing to take it. The liability conversation happens in boardrooms and courtrooms. What happens right now, today, is a sovereignty and response question. And here's what's driving me mad about the mainstream framing of this. The media keeps running science explainers about what hantavirus is. What nobody's running is a serious interrogation of why the international response architecture looks exactly like it did in early 2020. Reactive, measured, institutional. We have no vaccine for hantavirus. We have no widely available antiviral treatment. And we have an organization, the WHO, with an annual budget of over $6 billion that is still, in 2026, telling the world to stay calm and wait for more data. At some point, wait for more data has to be recognized as a strategy that costs lives.
Here's what I want to know, and I want both of you to think about this carefully. If additional cases are confirmed when these passengers from 23 different countries eventually disembark, are we structurally prepared to trace those contacts and contain it? Or are we about to watch the same slow-motion institutional failure we've seen before? Sophia, where do you see this going?
The way I see this playing out, there are really two tracks running simultaneously. The most probable outcome is that hantavirus's known transmission characteristics, it doesn't spread efficiently between humans, contain this to the ship, the confirmed cases are managed, and the story drops off the news cycle in 2 weeks. But here's the risk that concerns me from a structural standpoint. If even 2 or 3 of those 23 nationalities return home before full laboratory confirmation and contact tracing protocols are established, you have an international trace exercise that depends entirely on the cooperation and competence of health ministries across multiple continents. Some of those ministries are excellent, some are not. The real trajectory I'm watching is whether this becomes the case study that finally forces maritime biosecurity regulations to be meaningfully updated, or whether the industry lobbies quietly against reform once the immediate crisis passes. History suggests the latter is more likely than the former.
Here's what concerns me most. And I want to be precise about this because I'm not trying to be alarmist. The 17 Americans on that ship means this story has a political dimension in Washington that it doesn't yet have in Brussels or at the WHO. If any of those 17 Americans are confirmed cases, or if cases emerge in U.S. states after disembarkation, you will see congressional interest in this within 72 hours. And that actually matters, because American political pressure is sometimes the only thing that moves international health institutions faster than their default bureaucratic pace. The risk isn't necessarily that hantavirus becomes the next global pandemic. The science makes that unlikely. The risk is that we respond to this specific outbreak adequately, pat ourselves on the back, and then do absolutely nothing about the systemic gaps that allowed it to happen. That's the pattern. That's always been the pattern. And until we break it, we're just counting down to the next one.
3 dead, a ship nobody wants, and a health bureaucracy the world is somehow still trusting to get this right. Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves, thank you both. If tonight has proven anything, it's that when the next outbreak comes knocking, the question won't be whether we saw it coming, it'll be whether we had the courage to act before the body count made it impossible to ignore.